Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on the New South, tenant labor, convict leasing, and the redemption of white power. The core question is this: what did freedom mean after Reconstruction when Redeemers controlled the ballot, labor rules, and racial code together? The core competency is to describe the social and economic experiences of Southern peoples following Reconstruction. What does freedom amount to after Reconstruction if the men taking power back can write the ballot rules, the labor rules, and the racial code at the same time? When federal troops withdrew in 1877, Southern Democrats, calling themselves Redeemers, moved quickly to dismantle the biracial institutions built during Reconstruction and to restore white political control. That restoration did not reject modernization. It paired racial hierarchy with railroads, mills, and investment campaigns, producing a New South that advertised progress to Northern capital while limiting who could share in it. Henry Grady of the Atlanta Constitution became the best-known spokesman for that program. In the 1880s, he pointed to textile mills in the Carolina Piedmont, iron and steel in Birmingham, and railroad expansion across the region as proof that the South had left slavery and secession behind. His language reassured investors that order had been restored and that the region was ready for profit. It also insisted that white Southerners should manage the race problem without federal interference, which meant economic modernization would proceed on local racial terms. Those terms were explicit. Black workers were excluded from many industrial jobs or confined to the most dangerous and lowest paid positions, while violence, intimidation, and legal maneuver narrowed black voting and weakened poor white opposition. Redeemer governments cut taxes, reduced spending on public education, and designed state power to protect property more reliably than people. The New South therefore posed a high-stakes question from the start. Could a region call itself modern while rebuilding political rule through disfranchisement and labor subordination? While cities like Atlanta and Birmingham grew, the majority of the Southern population remained tied to the land. After the failure of land redistribution during Reconstruction, most black families and many poor white families had no choice but to work land owned by someone else. This led to the dominance of sharecropping, a system in which the landowner provided a plot of land, seed, and equipment in exchange for a share of the final crop, usually half. Sharecropping was a response to the Southern labor crisis after slavery. It allowed landowners to maintain control over labor without paying wages, and it offered families a degree of autonomy that was unavailable under the gang labor system of the plantation. However, sharecropping was inextricably linked to the Cropleyan system, which created a permanent cycle of debt. Because sharecroppers lacked cash, they had to buy food, clothing, seed, fertilizer, mule feed, and tools on credit from local merchants or from the landowner's commissary. The merchant took a lien, a legal claim, on the future crop as security for the debt. Interest rates on these loans were astronomical, often ranging from 20 to 60%, and the furnishing merchant frequently controlled the price of bacon, flour, cloth, and plow gear entered into the annual account book. At the end of the harvest, the sharecropper would turn over his portion of the crop to the merchant to settle his accounts. In most cases, the value of the crop was not enough to cover the debt and interest, leaving the family in the hole and legally obligated to remain on the land for another year to work off the balance. Redeemer governments helped create the conditions that made this rural dependency durable. Beginning in states such as Mississippi, South Carolina, and Louisiana in the mid-1870s, conservative Democrats regained power through fraud, intimidation, and paramilitary violence, then redirected state policy away from Reconstruction experiments in public schooling and civil rights enforcement. The Mississippi Plan of 1875 combined economic coercion with open terror at polling places, and its methods were copied elsewhere. Once Redeemers controlled state houses, county courts, and sheriff's offices, the law of debt and contract was enforced by officials who were politically committed to restoring planter authority. The Cropleyan system also forced the South into a dangerous dependency on cotton. Merchants insisted that farmers grow cash crops that could be easily sold on international markets rather than food crops that would allow for family self-sufficiency. This overproduction of cotton led to falling prices and soil exhaustion, further impoverishing the region. The debt peonage created by the Cropleyan system was a form of economic coercion that replaced the legal coercion of slavery. A sharecropper who tried to leave the land without paying his debts could be arrested and returned by force. This was a legal and economic trap that made genuine independence nearly impossible for millions of Southern families. The annual settlement cycle kept that trap administrative and local. County merchants advanced goods in spring, entered every sack of flour or length of cloth into ledgers, and then claimed first rights to the crop when autumn cotton reached the gin. If prices fell between planting and sale, the furnishing account swallowed the tenant's share. Tax assessors, justices of the peace, and sheriffs reinforced the same order through crop seizures, labor contract prosecutions, and auction sales of livestock or tools. A family could work an entire year and still end it with no cash, no ownership stake, and a new balance carried forward into the next planting season. The impact of this system fell most heavily on black Southerners, who had the least access to capital and legal protection. Sharecropping and crop lien arrangements allowed white landowners and merchants to manage black labor through the account book rather than the whip. It also reinforced the racial hierarchy by keeping black families in a subordinate economic position. The rural South remained a territory of poverty and dependency, even as the cities of the New South celebrated their industrial progress. The New South on the land was a system of modernized tenantry that used the law of debt to enforce the logic of the plantation. Redeemer lawmakers then reinforced that economic order with disfranchisement. Mississippi's Constitution of 1890 imposed poll taxes, residency requirements, and literacy or understanding tests administered by white registrars, and South Carolina, Louisiana, and other states copied the model during the 1890s. These devices were presented as race-neutral election reform, yet county officials used them selectively to remove black voters and many poor whites from the electorate. When the same courthouse managed crop liens, tax rolls, labor contracts, and voter registration, political exclusion, and economic dependency worked together through one local machinery of rule. The most brutal feature of the New South labor market was the convict leasing system. After the Civil War, Southern states faced the dual problem of destroyed infrastructure and a perceived threat from newly freed black citizens. In response, they passed black codes and vagrancy laws that criminalized unemployment and minor social infractions. These laws were used to arrest thousands of black men who were then sentenced to long prison terms. Because the states lacked the funds to maintain prisons, they leased these convicts to private companies, railroads, coal mines, phosphate mines, and turpentine farms in exchange for a fee. The arrest pipeline was built into ordinary county administration. Sheriffs swept up men on charges such as vagrancy, loitering, changing employers without permission, or speaking back to white officials, and local judges imposed fines the accused could not pay. Once court costs were added, the sentence converted directly into leased labor. In Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, lessees signed contracts with state officials for fixed payments per convict and then worked those men in mines, brickyards, lumber camps, and railroad grades. The paperwork looked like revenue management. The human result was a labor draft run through county courts. Convict leasing was a bridge between the plantation and the industrial New South. Companies like the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company and the Pratt Mines in Alabama used leased convicts as a cheap and disposable labor force. For the private company, convict labor was more profitable than slave labor because the company had no long-term investment in the worker's survival. If a convict died from exhaustion, disease, or violence, the state would simply provide another. Mortality rates in convict camps were catastrophic, often exceeding 20% per year. This was an industrialized form of slavery that allowed the New South to build its infrastructure and extract its minerals with coerced labor. For the state, convict leasing was a source of revenue and a tool of racial control. It relieved the taxpayers of the cost of the justice system and generated a surplus for the state treasury. It also served to terrorize the black community and suppress labor organization. A free worker who complained about wages or conditions knew that he could be arrested and leased into a coal mine where survival was unlikely. The system turned the Southern justice system into a labor brokerage for private industry. It was the most extreme expression of the New South's commitment to using state power to provide cheap, coarse labor for industrial development. Convict leasing lasted well into the 20th century. It was defended by Southern politicians and businessmen as a necessary and efficient way to manage a criminal population and build the region's economy. It was only after decades of investigation and protest by black activists, labor reformers, and journalists that the system was gradually abolished. The Southern penal system and the mines, brickyards, and rail beds built by leased labor still show how fully the New South tied industrial growth to state-managed coercion. In 1896, the Supreme Court gave Southern segregationists a national constitutional shield. The case began in New Orleans, where Homer Plessy, backed by the Citizens Committee, entered a whites-only railway car to force a test of Louisiana's separate Carr Act. His lawyers pressed the 13th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because they needed the court to say that caste legislation in public transportation violated national law and the constitutional order itself. Justice Henry Billings Brown's majority opinion supplied the language segregationists required. In a 7-1 ruling, he wrote that the 14th Amendment enforced legal equality, but did not erase racial distinctions or compel what he called social equality. Then came the sentence that armed Jim Crow legislators for decades. If separation stamped black citizens with a badge of inferiority, that result existed solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. Brown lifted humiliation out of the statute and relocated it into the minds of the people being humiliated. Those words did more than decide one railroad dispute. They translated local white supremacy into a rule states could cite in statute books, court briefs, and legislative debates. Once the court accepted separate but equal, Southern lawmakers extended segregation across schools, hospitals, parks, theaters, juries, and cemeteries. Federal retreat no longer needed to be implied. It was written into the constitutional order that state officials now claimed as permission. John Marshall Harlan's lone dissent answered Brown in language meant for a future court and a future politics. Our Constitution is colorblind, he wrote, and it neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. Harlan called out the caste structure hiding behind the statute and warned of mischievous consequences. His words survived in the U.S. reports, but Brown's majority opinion governed the South that sheriffs, registrars, railroad conductors, and legislators were actually building. The consequences of the New South defined the region for generations. Sharecropping, convict leasing, and Jim Crow produced a South that could boast mills, rails, and urban boosters, while remaining the poorest section of the country by education, health, and economic mobility. The modernization Henry Grady advertised drew investment, but it did not build a broad middle class or democratic labor order. Plessy versus Ferguson gave segregation constitutional shelter in 1896, and the disfranchisement campaigns that followed fixed a caste system into law, policing, schools, transit, and county government. Black communities built churches, schools, businesses, newspapers, and mutual aid institutions under those conditions, but endurance did not change the fact that coercion had become part of the region's normal administrative routine. The labor side of the system lasted just as long. Sharecropping tied families to merchants and landlords through crop liens and annual debt, while convict leasing gave employers access to coarse labor under state authority. Low wages, anti-union habits, and subsidy-driven development remained central to Southern political economy long after the original Redeemer generation passed from power. The unresolved judgment is not whether the New South produced some growth. It plainly did. The harder choice is whether development built through disfranchisement, coercive labor, and legally organized white supremacy should count as modernization at all, or whether the region's celebrated progress was inseparable from the inequalities it claimed to have solved.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.